What do you think we should do? How do you think we should deal with if the governments create a false flag operation or invasion, one that includes violence and fear?
Well, you know what's interesting? When I'm asked that question, what I immediately go to, which shocks people, is that they've already done it. And I know there's a pregnant pause there, but for about 50 years, the classified programs dealing with UFOs and extraterrestrial intelligence has been feeding into the public an enormous amount of disinformation that's tailor-made to create fear and hatred of extraterrestrial civilizations. And this information has come out in a number of ways. The number one way is through the UFO subculture. The secondary way is through the Hollywood film industry and also through cable television series. So if you look at this subject and just step back, you'll see that about 80 to 90% of the material out there is framed in a very dualistic way of us versus them, and there are good ETs and bad ETs, and they've invaded, and they're taking people and doing horrible things to them, and on and on and on and on. It turns out that that was a plan that was concocted back in the 50s, and there's a CIA document that's, I know we have a lot of material on our website, but it's from 1953, where the CIA talks about using the subject for, and I'm quoting from this document, psychological warfare value and purposes. Then you find that there's a Strategic Studies Institute document from the 90s that talks specifically about creating a global fear around the alien issue by using what's called stagecraft to stage certain abduction scenarios and other frightening scenarios using advanced aerospace anti-gravity vehicles and other modalities to hoax events. And this shocks most people. So people have had real contact, and then there's other stuff that's gone on. I remember a number of years ago I was interviewing an Army Ranger who I could get to come out on publicly for the Disclosure Project, who was on a squad that was part of one of these abduction squads going around abducting people, making it look like it was an ET encounter when it wasn't. Now, this is not to say that everyone who's had an encounter with an ET or UFO has been targeted by a covert military program, but a lot have. And it's gotten mixed in with the real cases. And so what you find is that it's sort of like if you had some golden nuggets in a mountain of fool's gold and someone just dumped on the real contact events that people have had a whole mountain of other cases that have been designed to deceive people. And that is the problem what you have in on the internet and on this subject. And it's been actually a very effective program, because I remember years ago when my children were little giving a talk at an elementary school, and I was talking about what we were doing and going out and making contact and all the great experiences we'd had. And one of the little children, I think this was maybe 6 or 7-year-old, said, "But aren't you afraid, Dr. Greer, that they're going to come and abduct you and torture you and do terrible things to you?" And this is a little child. So what you find is that this has found its way into the subculture so well. Now, why is that important? Because, and you can look at the history of World War II, and for that matter, the Cold War and the war on terrorism to analyze this. You really can't get the public to support any kind of scenario, if it's false flag or what have you, without having first demonized an enemy. So certainly that's what Adolf Hitler did in sort of demonizing the Jewish population and gay people and the Roma, so-called Roma, the Gypsies, and others. And this has been done all through the Cold War and propaganda efforts. And it was done, of course, in other scenarios. The Gulf of Tonkin incident is a famous case, of course, where they hoaxed and staged an attack on our own Navy vessels to expand the Vietnam War, because there was growing consensus that we should just not go into that misadventure, and the military-industrial complex and the warmongers and profiteers wanted us to expand that operation. So this kind of manipulation goes on all the time. I know some people say that's a rather cynical view. It isn't a cynical view. It's a historic and accurate view. And for that reason, what I've always said to folks is knowledge is the greatest purifier. Wonderful quote from the Vedas. And if you know that something is being staged and there is stagecraft and that there are advanced anti-gravity devices made by Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and other companies that can hoax an event, knowing that is halfway to not being tricked by it. So again, knowledge is very important, because in the vacuum of that, and this is what you find in the UFO subculture, a lot of people don't realize that what our capabilities are. So they think anything that goes bump in the night that's unusual has to be extraterrestrial, because they haven't studied what the capabilities are within the really high-end contracting world in the aerospace industry and the intelligence community, and importantly, counterintelligence, and this sort of creating, sowing the seeds for a false flag operation. And of course, this was one of the things that Wernher von Braun on his deathbed was very concerned about, is that he knew personally about plans to eventually, after, he said, the Cold War and after global terrorism. And by the way, our testimony from Carol Rosin on that came before 9/11, was acquired before 9/11. But then after that, they would play this card of a threat from outer space, like Ronald Reagan said at the UN, where wouldn't it be easier to unite the world if we had a common alien threat to unite against? And I always thought, when I heard that, I said, how sad that people think the only way we can unite each other is to create a bigger enemy in space. This is not going forward. This is taking 10 steps backward, because we're trading international conflict and ethnic conflict for interplanetary conflict, which is not only insane, and not survivable, but a complete hoax. And so, but knowing about it and exposing that hoax is really, really important. Now, that I was told back years ago by a man who wrote something called The Controllers, a Martin Cannon, who had discovered a lot of these false flag operations that had been going on for decades in the UFO subculture. And he told me personally, he says, if you begin to expose this part of the agenda, they will do everything to marginalize you and defame you and attack you. And the counterintelligence community will stand up everything they can, because this is part of their long-term plan. And that's what Carol Rosin talked about, as did Wernher von Braun, is that there was this plan to be able to move from global superpower conflicts and then global terrorism issues to some larger existential threat that's out in space. And of course, that way you can grow the military-industrial complex from $1 trillion a year to $2 or $3 or $4 trillion a year globally. And it's a little bit like the movie Independence Day, where they go, let's kick alien butt, and it's like this whole, let's unite the world in fighting these marauding, and that's, of course, the stock and trade of 90% of Hollywood movies on this subject, as well as, unfortunately, most documentaries on this subject, which is why we wanted to do something different with the film Sirius. I don't think people really understand, Matt, how deep the capabilities are. Many people will see some of the things that have happened. They'll say, oh, well, humans couldn't have done that, could they? The answer is yes. I mean, if whatever you've heard about in terms of really high-tech military warfare in electronics and aircraft, there are things that are 20 generations more advanced that are in these so-called unacknowledged special access projects or super black projects. And have they been used to create scenarios that confuse people and scare people? Yes. So in a sense, we're already living in that period of, I call the preparatory phase. And for the most part, the public have bought that hook, line, and sinker. And that's the unfortunate part. I think all we can do is say, look, before everyone starts running Chicken Little style, oh my God, the sky is falling, people need to stop and look at what the agenda would be. Who benefits from this kind of us versus them duality? And is that really the future we want? Do we want to go from conflicts amongst people and ethnic groups and races and national groups and economic philosophies and what have you into interplanetary conflict? I think most sane people would say no. But if people can be manipulated in their beliefs and their perspectives and their prejudices, then it makes it easy to then do something that would be a false flag event, because they've already prepared people, like this little child that asked that question, to be predisposed towards thinking there's a threat out there, and that, oh yes, we need to come together as a people to resist that. Now, of course, when this was asked to me by a man at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base some years ago, there was a colonel, Canola, who was sort of very senior at the Foreign Aerospace Science and Technology Center, which had been the Foreign Technology Division of the Air Force that had received the Roswell crash remains. And when I was sitting out there at this meeting, a meeting he did not want to have, he was ordered to have it with us by the head of Air Force Intelligence, who was ordered by the head of Intelligence Joint Staff to make it happen. And he turned to me, he says, well, what if some of these civilizations are hostile? And I said, well, let's think about this for a minute. You're talking about civilizations that have the ability to go faster than the speed of light and travel amongst star systems. Their technologies would be in the hundreds of thousands to millions of years more advanced than ours. If they were hostile, we wouldn't be sitting in this room breathing the free air of Earth. It would have all been over about the time we detonated the first atomic bomb at the Trinity site. I said, the fact that they have not engaged in that kind of event, it kind of shows the kind of restraint they obviously have, because we have been firing at them periodically and occasionally hitting them. So I think that, the kind of fear that is out there, and if there's all kinds of phobias out there. There's racism and anti-Semitism and homophobia, and you can add to this now exophobia, the fear and hatred of extraterrestrials. This is sort of the thing that is not useful, but I think that if you were looking at it from a strategist point of view of how do we control large numbers of people on a subject that they don't really control. They don't really control what the ETs are doing and how they're coming and going. They know that they can control psychologically the masses through fear-engendering events, which is exactly, the kinds of things that have happened in other false flag operations. So I think the only way to handle that is to discuss it, put it out there, and this Strategic Studies Institute document is up. We have it. This is something that other people. Before I got involved in this subject, Matt, there were folks who had done very extensive research into the hoaxing and staging of frightening pseudo-encounter events. But no one wants to hear that because everyone likes to have someone to hate, and so it's unfortunate that that's a part of human nature that has this sort of tribalistic aspect where we're wanting to find something other than us that we feel superior to, that we can hate and then engage in warfare. And this has been the organizing principle for humans for many, many thousands of years. And I think what we have to do is say, isn't it time for us to find a different way of living that isn't based on someone other than us that we have to be afraid of and hate and engage in violent conflict with? With the kind of technology we're talking about, which are much more sophisticated weapons, say what are called scalar and other type of weapons than the weapons that are say, thermonuclear and atomic weapons. With that kind of technology, you're talking about a non-survivable event if there was a conflict. Because even with nuclear weapons, it was called mutual assured destruction. And, Carl Sagan used to talk about the nuclear winter, and it'd be just the end of life as we know it if we had had a full-out conflict with the Soviet Union. Do people really think that we're going to go Star Wars style out in space and have interplanetary conflict? Well, this is silly, because people who think that have looked at too much science fiction and haven't thought about what the consequences of these kinds of technologies that have been weaponized, and they are weaponized in classified projects, would do if there was this kind of engagement with a threat from outer space, as Ronald Reagan called it. Mm-hmm. So this is a really deep issue. I mean, at some point one could do an entire book on this. A few people beat me to the punch on the other side of the discussion, and I know a couple years ago there were some Lockheed Martin scientists who talked about how we should never we shouldn't try to make any contact with extraterrestrials because it's likely that they will want to engage in a hostile conflict, but we need to be preparing now for that conflict. And, of course, these were people who were tied into the aerospace industry, which would receive the contracts for the multi-trillion-dollar build-up.